Alright, in this video, the video on writing, we're going to first talk about the rest of the readings for this week from the Norton Field Guide, the Guide to Writing Research, and my blog. Then we're going to talk a little about moving from those original research questions that we covered in the last video into a working thesis for our first essay. We're also going to talk a little bit about integrating the sources that we find into our writing. So this lecture is really focused on putting your thoughts together into writing and getting that rough draft done. That will include, of course, talking about signal phrases, works cited, and using your Norton Field Guide to help you with any questions you have about format. And finally, I will also, in this video, give you the requirements for your rough draft that is due on Friday. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, just the rest of this week's reading, you should have already read all the stuff about research as you watched the last video. The rest of the stuff is all about writing again. You're going to read my formal essay theory, which basically is going to talk about the essay as a relationship and give you some ideas for basic structure. You're also going to read Chapter 8 in your Guide to Writing and Research at Oklahoma State, which is all about the research question, which we covered in the last lecture, and we're going to continue to talk about in this lecture what a research question is, and of course what a thesis is, because that's the next important step, to have a good, clear thesis. And then the first 6 chapters of your Norton Field Guide, should be review. You probably read these in Comp 1, but these are the basics that you need to just be sure you know, the important choices that you make during the writing process and the characteristics of academic writing. So look back over that stuff. Be sure that you have a clear understanding of what's expected of you in academic writing, and be sure you're always thinking about writing as a series of choices that you make. I think that's a really important way to approach it. Alright, now we're going to go back and look at, think about the research questions that we developed earlier on in the process and how we're going to move from that into a good working thesis statement for our rough draft. Alright, as you're getting ready for Essay 1 and thinking about how to move forward with your idea, some things to be considering. Are you going to be talking about the entire movie or the entire television show? Obviously, it'd be probably easier to talk about an entire movie than it might an entire television show. Some of those things go on for years and years and years. You want to think about ways of narrowing your topic. Maybe you want to just look at character, one character or a couple of characters, and what those characters represent, or perhaps genre. Maybe series, season, episode, character. There are all sorts of ways to break this down. But what I want you to be thinking about is making sure that you have a topic that's appropriate for this paper, which is only 4 to 5 pages. So hopefully as you're doing some of your critical research, seeing what other people are saying about these shows or movies, you're getting good ideas of how to sort of limit your scope and find a way into what you want to talk about. And that's what we want to talk about now, is moving from our original research questions and the research that we do into a thesis, a working thesis, right? So your thesis, as defined in the guide, is your take on your subject that stabilizes and defines your work. And it comes from your research and what you think about it, right? So the thesis is your point. This is the point that you're making that stabilizes and defines the essay that you're writing. And it should come out of the research that you do and out of the thinking that you do about that research and about the primary texts that you're looking at. So one of the things that I always like to give students is this. I'm a big fan of giving you patterns and plans and ways to go about doing things. I like to always start my papers with a working thesis that begins, "In this paper, I will." And then what I do is I fill in the blanks, right? I say what I'm going to argue, which is my take about my topic, right? I'm going to say how I'm going to argue it, looking at what and in what way. I'm going to explain why. What's the point of this paper? Why is it something that I should be interested in? This is what we call the so what question, and it's the most important question that you can answer in an essay. I should never be reading your essay and think, so what? Right? This is something you always want to know. So I find that this model works well for me. If I just write, "In this paper I will," and then sort of start to tell myself and my reader what I'm going to do, I generally come up with a pretty clear working thesis. And keep in mind, your working thesis can be more than one sentence, right? It can be It's the full idea. So here are some sample working thesis statements, right? In this paper, I will analyze James Franco's portrayal of a modern news reporter in The Interview, if anybody saw that movie, by showing how he emphasizes the emotional aspect of modern media in order to explain why The Interview is more than just a dumb comedy and is in fact important satire in the 21st century. Right? So here what I've done is I've told you what what I'm looking at in what text. Right? I'm looking particularly at James Franco's performance in the text The Interview. Right? And I'm going to look at how one aspect of that, an aspect of that that performance that emphasizes the emotional aspect of modern media, right? The way that modern media will attempt to scare us or attempt to get emotional confessions out of people rather than necessarily reporting on what's important that's going on around the world, right? So I'm going to look just at that specific aspect here, and I'm going to then explain why that's important as my so what question in this third point, right? Because if we recognize that what James Franco was doing there is pointing out one of the problems with society, then we see that this is more than just a dumb comedy. It's actually satire and works in a different way. All right, so that's a sample working thesis. In this paper, I will do this by doing this in order to do that. All right, that's one way to do it. Here's another one. In this paper, I will analyze the traditional characters and plot lines of The Office, showing them to be common characters and plot lines that have been entertaining audiences for thousands of years in order to explain The Office's long life and popularity on television, right? So we're thinking I started this with the research question, why is The Office so popular, right? Well, I'm going to answer that question. I'm going to say The Office is popular and ran on television for a long time precisely because it draws on a very old and long tradition of characters and plot lines. And that's what I'm going to show you with my analysis. I've probably analyzed 2 or 3 episodes in this paper, showing each of them to be, part of a longer tradition that I would understand based on my research. Right? So hopefully that helps you get some ideas about what a working thesis should look like for Essay 1. All right, well, hopefully you've got a pretty good idea now of how to move from those research questions that we developed earlier into a working thesis and moving forward with coming up with an idea for this essay. If you still have questions about that, obviously consult your reading and consult me. Send me an email. I'm happy to look at ideas and let you know what I think about them. That'll also be something that's addressed in the discussion board. Questions for this week. I'm going to have you talk about what you've chosen as your topic and what questions are guiding you and maybe thinking about how you're moving toward a working thesis. Once you get a working thesis, of course, you're going to need to start drafting. You've got a draft due Friday. I'll give you some requirements for that at the end of this video, don't worry. And you're going to need to start thinking about how to go about setting up a good essay. Now think about the formal essay theory that I gave you. Think about the things you read in your Norton Field Guide for today from the first 6 chapters. Think about how an essay is set up. You're going to have a good clear introduction that grabs your reader's attention, sets up your argument, gives me your thesis, right? And then supports that thesis through analysis of both primary and secondary sources, right? So what I want to think about and talk about right now really quickly is how to use those sources, how we're going to write using our primary and secondary sources. So I want to give you some tips for integrating sources using signal phrases, for how to cite those sources using MLA and APA format, and really just basically how to find things in your Norton Field Guide so that you can cite things correctly and begin to get your drafts drafted. Once I give you these tips for integrating sources, we're going to move right into your to-do list for this week, which will include the guidelines for the rough draft that's due Friday, as well as everything else you need to get done this week. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about how to integrate sources, both primary and secondary sources, right? First of all, when using sources in the body of your essay, always be sure that it is clear what information comes from what source, right? So if you're quoting Michael Scott from The Office, make sure that I know that that's a character saying whatever it is you're saying he's saying and not a critic, right? It always needs to be clear. The easiest way to do this is, for me, regardless of which documentation style you use, is to use good signal phrases to identify your sources. So what are signal phrases? They're the most efficient and readable way to cite a source, first of all, and you can find all you need to know about signal phrases on page 471 through 474 of your Norton Field Guide. Uh, Basically what they are is they're ways of introducing material and identifying your sources. They signal for your reader who's saying what, so it's always clear. So an example of a writing that's hard to read, right? This bad example: writing an argument is never without purpose. Smith 82. Technically, that's correct according to MLA format. But you can see that it's not as easy to read as the next example. Ben Smith claims, or argues, or asserts, or writes, or whatever, that writing an argument is never without purpose. Right? So you see how the difference there in the second sentence. I can clearly see just from reading the sentence who is saying this. In the first example, I have to get into those parentheses, and really, if you nobody likes to get into the parentheses. So just think of those parentheses as barriers that if you put something in them, it's meant to be something I can gloss over, that I don't need. So you don't want to put necessary information in the parentheses. So use your signal phrases like so-and-so claims, so-and-so argues, Michael Scott says, right? Michael Scott declares bankruptcy. These are good ways of incorporating your sources, right? Most good scholarly critical sources will have an identified author. Signal phrase works best because it puts most of the necessary information in the text, not in parentheses. As I was just saying, it makes it easier to read. So this way readers know who you're citing. They can either keep reading or check your works cited page for more information. It's just a better way to identify and cite your sources, right? Now, speaking of works cited, you do need to do a works cited page for this essay. It should be pretty simple, but it should include both primary and secondary sources, right? So your primary source is, of course, the movie or TV show that you're talking about, and your secondary sources are those critical articles, right? You need to see your Norton Field Guide for help with the works cited page. If you decide to use MLA format, it's on page 484. APA is on page 533. And I'm going ahead and giving you here the pages that you need to look at to cite your primary sources, your TV shows, your DVDs, internet videos, whatever. Those are on these pages, 516 and 520, 558, 559, and 557, depending on what style you use. For critical articles, again, see pages 513, 551, or 553. These will be the pages where you can find help for your works cited entries. Everything you need to know is in that Norton Field Guide. So learn it, love it, live it. Norton Field Guide. All right. You can also see sample essays on these pages if you just want to get a feel for what your essays should look like as you submit them. So here's what I want to see in your rough draft. First, I want to see you start an introduction. So think about what I wrote in my theory of the formal essay about introductions, and then lead into your working thesis. You should have a working thesis by now, or by Friday anyway. And then you're going to start working on supporting that thesis in your body paragraphs. Here is a model paragraph for how to do that. All right, you'll have a topic sentence, an example from your primary source, support from secondary source, and an explanation of how these examples support your thesis. All right, so here are some basic tips for what to do to get that rough draft going. Start with your introduction, give me a good clear working thesis, and start thinking about how I'm going to put these paragraphs together, incorporating examples from your secondary sources. Now, you don't need to have the full draft. You don't need 4 or 5 pages done by the end of this week. You will only need 2 pages. So let's move on and look at our to-do list now, and I'll give you a clear and specific assignment for the rough draft there. This week, you want to read and take your quizzes as always. Should have done a lot of that reading by now, so you'll take those quizzes, get it out of the way. You do have a discussion post due on Wednesday. If you haven't used the discussion board before on D2L, I have a video tutorial for how to do that. It's up in the content for this week as well, so you can check that out. That will also have instructions for submitting your rough draft. So that's also due Friday. That's the big thing. Now, here's what I want in your rough draft. I want a working thesis in this paper. I will, right, as we've discussed in this video. I also want to see at least 2 pages. You don't need to get me the 4 or 5 pages by the end of the week, but you do need to have at least 2 pages so that you have a good, clear start. And I want to see you have engaged at least one of your critical sources by Friday. Right? So you'll need to, by Friday, you'll need to do some research, you'll need to do some thinking, you'll need to do some writing. At least 2 pages of writing, including a working thesis and at least one of your sources. I want you to incorporate that source and use a good signal phrase to talk about it and begin working with it. Aside from that, as always, blog. I'll read your blog, read mine. My blog will be up on Wednesday talking about some things that I think are important for you to know. If you have any questions, as always, let me know. I'm more than available, and I look forward to hearing from you. I look forward to reading your blogs. I look forward to reading your discussion posts, and more importantly, I look forward to reading these rough drafts of Essay 1. So let me know if you have any questions. I'll talk to you all next week.